Okay, so this is the fourth video lecture on the topic of race and ethnicity. On the last one, I ended up talking about the theories of racism. So some of the theories about why people are more likely to be racist. You may have heard the term anti-racism. This is a much more common concept term that you hear these days. And so in this slide, I don't think this is actually included in your textbook. I wanted to talk a little bit about what that means, what it means to be anti-racist. So sometimes you'll hear people say, "Well, I'm not racist. I have a black friend," and that doesn't mean you can't be racist just because you have a black friend. What the opposite of racism is to be anti-racist, and what that means, it means a lot of things. But here's sort of a way to think about it, right? Anti-racism is not color blindness, and this is kind of a contrary notion because certainly when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we were taught not to see color. Well, the problem with not seeing color means that we're unable, or we fail to recognize how my experience in the world is different than the experience of, say, a black woman or a black man. We should see color. We should notice that the world treats me differently because I'm white than it treats somebody who's not white, right? That does not mean that I'm racist to notice, right? It simply means that actually I recognize that my experience in the world is different than somebody else's, right? It is the practice of calling out racist ideas, simply saying that is not appropriate. That is suggesting that one group is better than another group, where there is something that there is, or that message is saying that there's something wrong with another group. So to be anti-racist means you hold each other accountable. You hold your friends accountable. You hold your parents accountable. You hold society accountable for their racist ideas. So this is the third one here is a really important point. Creating a space for all people to be authentic. So this is grounded in that notion of white superiority, right? If our culture tells us that the way to be is to be white, then that means if I'm not white, then I can't be my authentic self. That if I'm not white, I have to put on a white mask, so to speak. I have to act some way that I'm not. Now, I don't have to deal with this. This is another example of what we mean by white privilege. I don't act white because how I act is the dominant, the the dominant cultural way. I don't have to spend all that additional cognitive energy. There's a phenomenon called scanning the room, or I don't think that's the word, but it's when someone who is not of the numerical majority walks into it. When you walk into a room and you sort of look around the room and try to figure out, where is it safe for me to sit, right? Where is it safe for me to, who in this room will accept me as a person of color, or will accept me as a woman if I walk into a room full of men, right? So that takes cognitive energy, which means I can't be my authentic self. To be anti-racist means we try to create safe spaces for everyone and for everyone to see themselves. It assumes that we're all racist some of the time, right? Because again, we've internalized this sort of message that white ways are better. That means occasionally, and it's not my fault per se. I don't necessarily intend for this, but my intentions are not really relevant here. It just means occasionally, right? Hopefully you will have this next one here, right? It's the practice of introspection and trying not to be this way, of looking at our own behaviors and our own ideas about how we interact with people and the first thoughts that we have with people, right? And trying to undo some of those internalized white superiority messages. And then the second to the last one here, right, is that assumes that the reason that when you walk into an organization and you see all the powerful people are white is not because white people are better, but simply because there have been barriers, that there are social structural barriers that have made it difficult for other people to um, to get to those particular places, right? So here's some good books here you see in this image. I've read New Jim Crow, finished this one last summer. White Fragility, some people find that one to be pretty controversial. This is a really good one too, written by a black man. and it's a story about his son, about how black men's bodies are treated differently than other people's bodies, about how, yeah, violence against black men. And then Just Mercy here is an attorney. I believe he works with men who, I have that one too, men who are on death row. Okay, moving on. But that's what anti-racism means. Discrimination, which I've mentioned in a previous video lecture, is really the action when we put our negative prejudicial attitudes and we we engage in actions that are that disadvantage certain groups, right? As I say, there's no such thing as reverse discrimination. So sometimes you'll hear that term tossed around. But the social scientific idea of discrimination is one where this is an action of the dominant group, right? The dominant group uses their power as a way of disproportionately penalizing people who are not members of the dominant group. And it would sort of be like saying that a teacher, I mean, you can get this, I think you can imagine this, but a teacher can discriminate against a student. But so what if a student decides they don't like the teacher? Can this teacher do anything about, I mean, can the student do anything about the fact they don't like the teacher? Not really. I mean, they can go in and complain, but they don't have the power. They don't have, their actions don't have the same consequences and don't have the same power as the teacher's racism and prejudicial bias towards the other. The same thing, like a person can get pulled over by a police officer, but the citizen can be discriminatory towards the police officer, but it doesn't matter. But the police officer's discrimination towards the person they pulled over, there's real consequences to that. There's not really reverse discrimination here. Okay, individual discrimination. So when I was talking about the apples, right, when I choose a red apple over a green apple, that's individual discrimination. Institutional discrimination is when the institutions have created policies or procedures that make it difficult for some people to access. So here's some really classic examples, right? That a corporation fills an open position with somebody who's already employed there. That discriminates against, it's a structure, it's a policy that makes it difficult for the people on the outside of that organization to gain access to that job. Children of an alumni receive preference for admission to a private college. Again, some groups have an advantage, other groups don't. Public meeting is held on the third floor without an elevator. So if I'm a person and I have mobility issues, I'm in a wheelchair, I'm on crutches, I can't get there, right? I'm systematically, the institution has made policies that make it difficult or impossible for a certain group of people to gain access. Fire department requires, and that one maybe not necessarily, I mean, that is discriminatory, but one could ask if that is maybe, that one maybe has a bit more logic to it. And a person accused of a crime who cannot post bail must show up in prison clothes. And this is sort of like a, I think, symbolic interactionism. How does that orange jumpsuit get perceived by the judge, or by other people, right? All of that versus if I had access to clothes that didn't have that label of being a criminal or of being, found guilty. All right, so here's some theories. Oh, looks like I've got a couple theories. That's pretty much all we have left. Symbolic interactionist theories about the way groups sort of interact with each other. One that you see a lot in higher education, or you see efforts that are sort of in line with this theory. This is what they call contact hypothesis. And what this theory says is that that racism, that we can overcome our internalized biases by simply having more interaction with people of different groups, right? And I think that one of the classic experiments was they compared attitudes, or they took people who had been in a dorm room, if they had a dorm, if their roommate was a person of color versus if their roommate wasn't a person of color. So equal cooperative tasks reduce prejudice. Doing race is kind of an interesting theory. This kind of goes along with some of the other examples that I've talked about, but this theory is that race is not based on how one physically looks, but it's based on how one acts. And so when we talk about when we talk about whiteness and brownness and blackness, what we're really describing is how people engage in the world, how they dress, the kinds of cars they drive, how they talk, right? How they organize their lives. That it really that we sort people out not based on what they look like, but how they be, right? How they interact. So again, you can still have that sort of internalized white superiority because the ways that are associated with being white are considered um, more better, superior. And then racial formation theory is a theory that says that the way that race is a concept that was decided by government officials, right, or politicians. So you use this classic example over here, the one drop rule, right, that was during slavery. If you had one drop of black blood, you were a slave, right? And Native Indigenous peoples, First Peoples, Native Americans, right? There's rules. Oh, who was that politician? Elizabeth Warren, I think it was, who got in so much trouble because she was using the white people Anglo model of ancestry, and to her understanding, she had the genetic markers, right, that said she was a member of a particular indigenous group. But within that indigenous group, that was not how they identified membership to their group. And they said, you're not one of us, right? Because racial formation theory says that the powerful people decide what those divisions are of different racial and breakdown groups. And so, for instance, a good example of that one is that every time the census has been done, there have been different categories, and the fact that a person has to choose one of these categories, right, this government policy mechanism, means that I have to force myself into that particular category and into that particular group. So the government then serves to maintain these racial divisions based in part by deciding what the choices within that group are. I hope that makes sense. I'm going to stop here.